Welcome back to Just Build It. The idea behind the show is very simple. AI has dramatically lowered the barrier to building software, but if anyone can build it, what actually changes? Today's guest is Melody Koh, a partner at NextView Ventures, who recently stepped into a new role at the firm as the chief product officer to help lead the firm's AI and data build out. What stood out to me really throughout her amazing pieces online and kind of play by play is how real this transition has become. She went from never writing a line of code to shipping a full stack app for her son in a single weekend, all the way through to now leading this build out internally. So we're gonna have a great conversation today about what that experience looked like, why product thinking is changing, and what it looks like to build a venture firm in this new AI native world. So, Melody, thank you so much for being here.
Yeah, glad to be here. And I'm sure it'll be a fun conversation.
Awesome. Well, just to get us started, you made a somewhat non-obvious move, stepping into chief product officer role at NextView. And
Mhm.
I'm curious, you wrote about it online a little bit, but I'm curious, what made you feel like that was the highest leverage kind of use
Mhm.
of time, and how did you think about the impact relative to investing?
Yeah, so I mean just for everybody else a little bit more background. Like I'm kind of a product person by professional background. So this is, the last did it at like real companies. Like venture firms are not real companies. We're pretty odd as a type of organization, but I would say the short version of it is as everybody know, AI is here. And the unique thing about this wave of technology change is that it is impacting knowledge work and what previously perceived to be non-consensus work. And venture is knowledge work. And so I think as investors who are looking at these AI businesses every day, we're always asking questions that, hey, what does this mean to our business? And I think it was a combination of internal reflection on like strategy and what the moves that we have to make to be a little bolder as opposed to status quo given the times. And also like honestly, like I think of the team, like I am the most natural person because I have more of a builder background and more recent history. And I think the other thing is just honestly it was personal interest. I think that like when I was purely in an investor seat, I would look at these AI businesses and try to imagine from the outside in, like what does that actually mean? Like, how does the models actually work? How do you actually build it? And this is a little bit of hindsight. After I stepped into this role, I realized like, oh my God, I'm learning so much more by, it sounds very obvious. It's like by being closer to the metal as opposed to being very far away. And I actually think makes me a better investor because I now have a very innate understanding of how the technology work, how these products work, what are the considerations. And but I would say that, like it was more of a at the time of making the decision, it was really just that I think it'll be a lot of fun. And I also think it's very important for the firm. And I also I was personally curious about like how far can we go in terms of pushing the boundaries and what does that mean? Like can we actually reinvent the craft? So
Yeah, all really great points. I think, obviously, as a builder yourself, I'm sure that that was a fun experience. Like, it resonates that it's just interesting to kind of be able to
mhm.
constantly trying new things, and it makes sense too that there's a real opportunity here to automate and scale things. And as you get closer to the metal, you're able to understand what those possibilities are and what kind of
Mhm.
companies are out there that are making a difference.
Mhm.
Um, I'm sure you're tracking a lot of this online as well, but I think what I'm seeing in the market is tons of venture firms hiring AI engineers. USV recently put out
Mhm.
a post about
Mhm.
kind of the different agents that they're leveraging in their internal processes. I'm curious, after doing this for a little bit now, like, one, what are you seeing within NextView that you think can be automated, or what are you building internally that you think is the highest value, highest leverage for the
Mhm.
team? And then what does rebuilding a venture firm mean actually in this age of AI? And how have you kind of seen that evolve as you've learned more and gotten more up to speed in the role?
This is personal opinion and to some degree shared by the partnership, but I would say it's could potentially be controversial. So there are two types of things I think you can do with AI, especially in the context of venture, but probably broadly applicable. Like one is what I would call things that gives you time leverage. So think like automation. Oh, well, read my emails and summarize my notes better, and I'll look up this information, da 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 da. Like, I think you add them up, they can save you time. And the argument for that school of activity is that, oh, well, the investors, the investment firm's most precious resource is partners' time. So when you save time, you get leverage. So this is like I call it time saving leverage activities or uh, automation activity. And the other category is alpha generation. So what I mean by that is, in investing, we do four things: see, judge, win, and portfolio support. So when you think about that, and you ask a question like, where can I get more alpha? Is it you're seeing 100x? You get 100x coverage? Is it you're front running the market with information that others might not have? Or you have a mechanism for getting that information that is proprietary data? Do you have ability to, at the upper funnel, if you see 100x, that means you also have to pick better to filter. Can you get better at your signal to noise ratio? Can you fundamentally pick better, which goes into like, can you diligence better? Can you make decision better for initial investment, follow-on decisions? And then can you win better? Like, what are the activities that gives you a higher win rate? So those are like alpha generating, in my opinion. I mean, sometimes these two concepts conflict because you're like, well, if the partner has more time, they can do more. They can take, if you save 2 hours a week, that's net four more meetings. That's more coverage. I would say that for the most part, our strong bias is towards the second category. And I think there's a lot of activities in the market. The easy stuff is the first category. But the harder stuff is the second category. But I also think the second category is more interesting and enduring because it is fundamentally changing your trajectory as a firm, that as opposed to, I'm not saying that saving me 2 hours a week is not helpful. It's always helpful. But I think you have to think about like, where are you unlocking exponential asymmetric return potential? So that's kind of how we're personally think, as a firm, that's how we think about it by and large. So I would say the blend of activities probably like 80-20. 80% is the second category, the 20% is the first category.
Okay. Makes a ton of sense. Well, interesting to hear, and potentially we'll dive in a little bit later. But I want to just take a step back and hear about your transition personally as well. I've been a longtime follower of you on LinkedIn, and I know you were talking a bit about kind of this arc of, going from never writing code to shipping a full stack app in a weekend. And I just would love to hear a little bit about your experience, mindset shift in that weekend, and kind of, was there a moment where it clicked, that you could kind of do something like this with AI? And what was that experience like for you? What kind of surprised you about that journey as someone who is potentially not technical and hasn't coded before?
Um, well, I actually think that the background matters a little less. Like, I've worked with engineering teams because I was in product roles and led product teams, but I'm not a CS trained person. I think what was most interesting, I mean, this is a lot of other people have talked about this, right? But it's natural language is a new programming language. That means a lot, like the barrier to quote unquote code has largely disappeared. That being said, there is a difference between how much you understand the underbellies of the system and how far you can push it. You're asking me specifically about like when I first started. Like my attitude back then, like was just okay. I'm doing this. I haven't shipped product for like 8 years, so let me see how far in 2025 someone who has never put up a PR can actually do. Because this is like think mid 2025 sounds like not that long ago, but it feels like a lifetime in AI. This is before Opus 4.5 came out, right? Clock Code is like 3 months old, but so I basically was like, okay, let me just see, both for like personal learning as well as thinking about it. We as a firm is not a large AUM shop, right? We're not going to be able to hire like a 15-person engineering team. But to start, I actually needed to first visibly understand what is the stack and how far you can go, right? This is when vibe coding was just coined, like less than 6 months old as a term. And so that's really kind of the impetus for me trying to be as hands-on as I can. And, and once I got into clock code, there's like no stopping. Because the most beautiful thing about this is that if you don't understand, just ask AI. Like it will explain it to you. It's like, I mean, from my career, I've always thought like there's nothing that cannot be learned because there's internet. Like when I was interviewing for my first product job, I don't know, 12 years ago, I remember the JD says, oh, SQL. I was like, I don't know what SQL is. So I just went on the internet and learned SQL in 2 hours just to make sure I know how to write SQL queries if I could ask. And obviously, it was never asked to write SQL queries. But once I showed up at the job, I was like, oh, knowing this is actually pretty helpful because I can query my own database and be useful for myself. But I think now the barrier is even more diminished. And I think that the last thing I would say is I actually wrote a blog post about this. I think it was called The Forward Relationship with AI, right? Like everybody starts with level one, but there is nothing actually stops you from going all the way to the top. And the only requirement, and in the blog post, I talked about a couple anecdotes around me. Like there's a friend of mine who, marketing comms background, and I've been talking her ears off about clock code. And she finally was like, okay, fine, I'll try it. And I mean, Clock Code, for those who haven't tried it, is the terminal-based CLI app, which is very intimidating. Like nobody ever operates in terminal, even for real engineers a lot of times. And she got over the hump. Like the hump is a mental hump, which is, oh, I'm not an engineer. But again, like this is all natural language. Just ask AI. It can explain it to you. And it'll never run out of patience. You'd be like, explain it to me like I've never written a line of code. And in my Claude MD, which is the system prompt equivalent for the user, I said, I'm a PM and I understand technical concept. I work with engineers. I've never written a line of code. And that's how you need to explain it to me. Right. And then she finally tried it. And then like 5 hours later, she texted me and we're like, how does anybody sleep? And she like built 3 apps the next day. And this is, by the way, this is Opus 4.6. This is a couple of weeks ago. Like the model has gotten a lot better. Like when I was working on it, first started using it August, September last year, the model was not nearly as good. You kind of round trip with the model quite a bit, and you have to kind of understand how to wrangle it. And the harness was not as good. But I think it's really, I honestly think it's a mindset thing. It's not a capability thing. Now, that being said, though, like people who understand engineering principles can still run a lot further than people who don't, right? So there's always like, it is a superpower that you get by multiplying your base capabilities. But I do think that the gap is not nearly as intimidating as people think.
Gotcha. That makes a lot of sense. And I think, 2 points that you mentioned that are really interesting are I agree. And all the conversations I've had so far, one is that the mindset is the biggest barrier right now. Like people feel intimidated about the opportunity in front of them, but once they kind of get hands on keyboard and actually are trying something, it's, like a light goes off and they're able to really unlock so much potential. And the second piece is that, the technical, non-technical gap is really dissolving, and it's becoming tighter and tighter. Obviously, like you said, it gives you a bit of a head start, but I think it's getting closer and closer. So I'm curious, like if you were to give advice like you did to your friend in marketing and comms, like what kind of advice would you give beyond just, hey, just get started, or is there anything that, lessons learned from your experience or exposure as a product leader that you would say, hey, these are the things I would tell you to do? And I guess, is there anywhere that you find AI falling short in some of those building opportunities at this point? Or is it kind of so fluid that As long as you just keep iterating, it's effectively kind of doing everything you're asking.
I would throw the question back to you, like, what is a persona to which I'm giving advice to? Because that impacts what the advice is.
Yeah, I think a lot of the people that are listening to this are very, are younger professionals who are potentially looking to dive in to building, but are not CS trained or not programmers by background, but are looking to kind of start to build out a lot of their own apps for either personal use cases or maybe some in the enterprise. And I think maybe just haven't experienced it yet, but I think are intrigued and want to get started.
Okay, so a couple of thoughts. One is just do it. The Nike commercial. I don't know if they still use that term. And two, joking aside, like, um, I firmly believe that there's a lot of anxiety and things that are happening in terms of jobs, right? What enterprises are doing, jobs and things like that. So like, and I think zooming all the way out, like I don't think we as a society, like right, the Citrini report, the Doomsday, the counter of that, like I wrote a response on that called Consensus Machine. But regardless, like I think we have no idea like how fast this moves. So the ground is shifting beneath us. One thing I do have high conviction on is for the next 10, 20 years to be a useful professional in the society, I think you need to understand how to manage and work with AI agents. Like how you need to manage, like, 10 years ago, I was managing a team of human beings. I think if I were to like be in an operating role or like this, right? Like everything, you're just managing agents. In order to manage agents, you kind of have to understand how they operate. And what is the best way to understand how they operate is just work with them. So I honestly think that is the skill that is hard. It's a visual thing that you only get when you have the muscle memory of, oh, yeah, it does this, or oh, this is what's happening because of this, or like, oh, this is not following the rule because it's not deterministic. Oh, da 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 da. So like, it is very hard to be like, let me just sit there and like get a course to understand how to work with AI agents. You kind of have to just use it and hammer it a lot. So then that leads to my next advice, which is I do think part of the benefit and the gift of something like these coding agents and agentic interactions that we're finally unlocking in 2026 is that there is no monopoly for building anymore, right? So what that translates to at a personal level is if you know how to use it, you can have a productivity arbitrage at a personal level within your organization, if you run your organization, because most other people are going to be lazy. So just don't be lazy, right? Like, I think there is the hump of like, oh, I'm so busy. Like, it does take time. Like, the first couple hours are potentially more painful than the next five. But I wrote a separate blog post is like, your 50th AI session should be better than your fifth because you're compounding the learning at a system level and in your brain. So and then like if people have any idea, right? Like this is also the age of like, there are a lot of things that don't exist in app stores because there is no business model to make money at scale. But that doesn't mean that it's not going to be useful for you. And then this same train of thought applies for SaaS all the way down to personal apps, right? So the couple apps I built are like super niche, but I want to use it. And its cost of building is the marginal cost is like my time and Claw Max subscription,
Yeah.
and I can learn. So I think that like if you really have the motivation, like I have two young kids, I have no time, and I have a full time job. Like all I do during weekend when I'm not watching my kids is I am in front of my computer doing stuff, and like there is no excuse to find time if you want to actually learn and get in front of it and benefit.
Yeah. No, it makes a ton of sense. I find, obviously finding time is hard for people, but this is important, and you gotta just get started and really iterate. I one thing you brought up that I'm fascinated by is that blog post that you mentioned in terms of compounding your learning. And I'm curious if you can just like for the audience, maybe elaborate a little bit on what the premise there was. I think, you know, as everyone can build, or if everyone can build, like I think there starts to become a different separation on like what generates a great builder
Mhm.
from maybe an average one. And I'm curious if you can maybe take that in two directions. Curious, like one, what's your hypothesis on how to continually improve
Mhm.
through that evolution as a builder? And then
Mhm.
how does that, I guess, or what separates the people who are great and utilizing AI to really supercharge and 10x or 100x leverage themselves versus maybe the people that are kind of just dabbling or kind of using it on a non-regular basis.
Yeah, so, not to keep going back to blog posts, but I've documented a lot of these thoughts. I reference them. Like, right, one post is like, "Why is your 50th, your 50th AI session should be better?" And the gist of that is really, you kind of think about managing a junior person. Like, for a first day person showed up, made a mistake, and you sit on one on one, like, okay, do not make this mistake again. For a human being, you're relying on that human being to take notes, to work into her kind of operating principles, and she needs to design her own operating procedure to make sure that that doesn't happen again. And then, as everybody who's managed people know, there are two types of employee: people who do that, and people who don't. And people who do that, you give them harder tasks. That's how they level up and they get better. And if 6 months later, you're finally like, oh, this is someone I can finally rely on. With AI, it's kind of exactly the same thing, except that it's not grumpy. And I will give you a very concrete example. Um, this morning, I have an open claw agent, and it was doing something, and basically it was reporting like, oh, here's the status of the day, and this cron job basically means the repeating task didn't run. And I was like, well, it didn't run. Why didn't you investigate? You should investigate, take initiative. Don't just tell me it didn't run. And then I said, capture it in the lessons. I was like, oh, I wrote it down. Here's my lesson. And then 2 seconds later, um, and then I was like, wait, didn't we make a decision to stop that repeating task? And it's like, oh yeah, let me go find, the history. And then it's like, oh, I found it. Here's the decision. But then here's the other documents that I did not update. So thus, I forgot. And I was like, okay, well, how would you design your own system so that this exact type of thing would not happen again? And it made a proposal like, oh, when we design an infrastructure change, we need to blah, blah, blah. And I was like, no, no, no. This is not about just infrastructure change. This is where the human judgment comes in. I'm telling the story because I'm trying to illustrate what can you have AI do to make itself run better, and also what are the types of things that only human can only do right now. Because its conclusion, by the way, is running on Claude Opus 4.6, which is the latest, most advanced model. Its own conclusion is, oh, this thing is about making infrastructure change. And I'm like, no, this thing is about every time there's a decision that was made between you and me, you need to go through all your other files to update said decision so that you have a canonical truth, because you're stateless. You wake up every 5 hours, you're like a brand new session. So you need to make sure your documentation is robust. But I can instruct that because I understand that the models are stateless and the sessions are stateless. So I understand finally what are the components that make it do what it does. And two, I can look at its proposal and say, actually, that's a junior level observation. The lesson is actually this. And then I have to point it out. But then once I point it out, it can then redesign its own system, how it does things next time. So that's like a very concrete example of like, and then you do this, then you run to various different mistakes. 3 months later, your thing is like much better than your thing 3 months ago, because every time we run into this, we do a retro, right? Like, or we do a one-on-one, we sit down like, okay, what happened? What do you think happened? Well, how do you make sure it doesn't happen again? Like, it's kind of the exact same thing as managing teams and people, except you just have to understand how AI works.
Yeah, I love that analogy. I think the comparison to the junior hire and then kind of the story really illustrates the trust and delegation aspect of that relationship really, really well. Um, I think one other thing that the blog or a different blog that you posted kind of also talked about was kind of um, this context gap as well
Yes.
that you
Oh,
saw.
this is
So
this morning. Yes.
yeah, so you've talked a little bit about, you know, individual builders feel superpowered
Yeah.
by AI.
Oh, right. This is a structural divide. Yes.
Yeah, and kind of enterprises have potentially struggled a little bit more there. So like curious if you can talk a little bit also about kind of what you're seeing there, and maybe you could talk even about some of the portfolio companies that you have worked with on a regular basis and how you think, you know, best in class kind of builders are kind of pushing this through at an enterprise level.
Yeah. I mean, I'll answer a lot of question first and then back to the former. I honestly don't think we solved the enterprise adoption problem. And there are a lot of different reasons that I think the post structural divide was trying to articulate that. Again, this is from like personal reflection. Um, just to bring it to a very concrete level. When you're working in cloud code, for example, the way the 101 is like, actually, let's document who I am, what's my job, what do I care about, how do I work, here's my standards. When you're in a ChatGPT session, it kind of is a one off, right? You have to constantly like redocument. That example with Open Cloud Agent 5 minutes ago, actually it was an illustrative example of a consistent and ever evolving and ever compounding context, right? Because the context is all here's a bunch of written things that we should know about me, my project, this project versus that project, how I prefer you to work, how we prefer our work standards to be, how do we check our work, and all that stuff. So if you think about like me, how I invest, what are the companies, how I judge companies, that is very easy to like document and get to a pretty good place, right? Oh, I connect to my, use MCP and Granola and Google Drive and Gmail, blah, 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 right? Like you have like 5, 10 tools. Once you're like, okay, let's do this for like 50 people across like 5 departments so that, by the way, the other thing I would mention is in order for agents to be any good, they have to understand what is the context, who is the person, like, again, back to the illustrative example, like in order for the output to be any good, it cannot be a generic agent. It has to be armed with business objective, personal objective, style, and all that stuff. And that's where your unique taste comes in, by the way, as well, right? So the problem there is like as you add headcounts and the size of the organization, synthesizing like context. And you're like, well, don't companies have databases and ERPs and CRMs? Like, yes, but most of how people get work done is tacit knowledge that is not documented anywhere, right? Most of the true knowledge of how we do things are painfully captured in people's heads. And I mean, we know this back to like your new hire. You literally have to go sit down and talk to 15 stakeholders in the first 2 weeks to even have half a sense of like what is happening, right? Like everybody has this experience, like, oh, let's do meet and greet and meet a bunch of department people because documentation is out of date. We're not good at documenting. Things are always changing, right? A spec goes into development and then changed 3 times. Does not the final product looks nothing like the thing that we defined. So enterprise documentation is just by definition lagging. And and then you're like, well, so how do you solve it at a personal level? Well, I solve it at a personal level because I get Claude to interview me, and then we spend a couple hours and we're like 80% there because I'm just me. But like, how do you do that times like 500 people and 1,000 people? And I think that's part of the reason, not the only reason, right? There's organizational inertia. There's people at different levels of AI familiarity. I talked about earlier, like in order to use the thing, you kind of have to know how the thing works to be able to leverage it well. So, but I think the context, exponentially complex context gathering in maintenance is part of the core reason why it is very, very hard for these AI products to actually be truly useful. I think the cases where it's shown the most leverage is areas where documentation is like the definition of the department, i.e. engineering, right? That's one part. And the two part is like in engineering, like AI is not deterministic. They are probabilistic things. So, back to the open claw example, it just said I forgot, even though it was documented to please do it this way. Right? So you cannot 100% deterministically guarantee its output. But in engineering, there's already established culture of guardrails called Git. You can reverse, like it's all backed up. You can revert if things go wrong. You can trace. There's logs. So, like from the cultural perspective, that is the first department to get started,
Mhm.
and that makes complete sense, right? So then the more you go to like the other side of the spectrum, where the knowledge and the norms and the know-hows are all in people's head, the harder I think it is. And I think it is completely unsolved in terms of like how we're going to go about.
Interesting. Okay, a lot of great things to unpack there in terms of kind of the contextual evolution and the importance of kind of the different parts of the org
Mhm.
that are going to be potentially next in terms of kind of the documentation and guardrails that you mentioned. But I want to just zoom back out here a little bit to kind of the topic that we started with, just to help us close this out. So I think the most interesting part, at least for me, from this conversation, is kind of your iteration in the venture landscape and kind of the tool building there. And we talked a little bit earlier about kind of how, on the sourcing, on the picking, the winning, and the portfolio support, like you think those are the highest leverage kind of areas potentially for building. And I just would want to kind of double click on that a little bit. So, you know, how as a firm, just like how do you think about differentiation as these tools become more widely available? How are you thinking about what to build and like where that help comes into play? Like you mentioned earlier, being able to see more things, being able to filter through things, and how do you kind of prioritize those different projects, kind of given the bandwidth constraints that you have? You're one person, and as you mentioned, there's not a huge team behind you. So curious if you can talk a little bit about kind of one, where you see the industry heading, but two, also how you think about the tactical projects that you're going to build out for NextView specifically.
Um, I was just talking to my partner Dave, and we're talking about this topic, and he used an analogy I'm gonna just freshly borrow. He was like, if you think like 15 years ago, there are not that many quant hedge funds. The fact that it was quant itself is a differentiation. Now there are lots of quant hedge funds, but they're all different because the taste is encoded in the algorithm, so to speak. So apply that exactly to some extent, right? Like maybe now, to some extent, having leverage in terms of sourcing and selection, right? Just by purely expanding your ability to cover and see is itself an advantage. In 10 years is probably a more everybody or a lot of us will have a version of that. And so the question becomes like, how does every firm sift through, right? In terms of the how you prioritize, I think is actually highly strategy related. A firm that does 200K check, non-lead, trying to build a portfolio construction of 50 names in a fund, their places of like high leverage is going to be different than, oh, we're doing Series A and we only lead. Like the way you spend your calories on upstream, downstream is all completely different, right? Like, so, and then the last point I would make is that there are more, compared to even like 24 months or 36 months ago, there are more of these like, we are AI for VC XYZ type things, which is fascinating because 5 years ago you'd be like, that's not a big market. Like, please don't build for venture capitalists. They're cheap, their funds are small, it's kind of cottage industry. Like, if you're trying to get software fees from them, like, you're not going to have a real business. Now there's definitely more. That being said, like, I think my increased realization is that the more, like, most of the vendors are actually just a prompt on a model with a UI. I mean, not all of them, but a lot of them are. Like, there's a couple of types of vendors, right? There's data sources, data vendors. There's like, help you automate XYZ thing, which, and then there's the, oh, we're gonna be like a database, data store equivalent. Like how do you ingest? Like CRM is in that category, but also like, oh, make sense of our emails and da 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 da. The problem with like buying 5 of these and try to stitch together is that, one, for the middle portion, if the product is just a prompt, well, I want my prompt. Like I want to iterate on my prompt. Like I want to be able to write a prompt and see the output and do a better one. Also, if you're scoring companies for me and that's the product, like how am I gonna like be able to add what I'm interested in, and where is the alpha on top of that? Right. So I think that's a problem with that kind of category of things, and mostly we don't buy that kind of thing. Um, in terms of like, other vendor, you try to integrate. Everybody faces the exact same challenge of, well, entity recognition. Like, we're early stage, right? So like, oh, this founder used to not be a founder, and then it became a founder, but a stealth company, and then stealth company becomes a known company. But then a known company changed name 2 times, and within the same name changed domain 3 times. How do we know it's actually the same thing? I mean, I don't know which CRM you guys use, but like regardless which one, Affinity or Adio, they probably all are bad at this because this is a very hard problem. And then when you have 5 other sources that sits on top of that, and you don't get a handle of that problem, the thing is just going to be a mess. It cannot make any sense of it. Right. So this is like another version of the context scaling, right? If I'm just like running a 1-person band, like I'm just running my own fund, everything can just be stored locally. And I have 100% handle because I don't need awareness of the rest of the firm. But when you're like, that's why this is hard. So I think that, again, we have a bias because I think I'm obviously an investor and I'm the product builder, but these days building AI products is basically prompt iteration. But the reason that is so important is because I know exactly how we screen companies. So I can literally look at the output and be like, oh, we need to change the prompt this way because this is how we should think about the market, as opposed to, oh, here's how we should think about the founder. And I cannot outsource that to a vendor because they don't know. They're not investors. They're not NextView investors. They're not me. So that's kind of the tension. And I think that like, if you, to the extent that firms are hiring non-investors, so that I think this is why like it's hard to hire the right person. Like if you hire, I don't know, X data scientist at Unicorn Y, that person has no venture investing context. So I think the only way that could work is a GP, a senior enough person, has to spend significant amount of bandwidth to be able to make any progress. Because otherwise you're going to have like, oh, people like sitting in the corner and build some stuff that might or might not be used by the investment team. Because as you know, like this is a pretty weird job, and venture firms are not real companies. They partnership structure is weird, internal dynamics is weird. Everybody does things differently, and this is also why it's hard to build shared workflow layers that fits everybody, because everybody has their quirks in terms of how they want to prosecute deals, how they want to get to founders. Yeah.
Yeah, it's all about, as you said, kind of also that internal taste and kind of utilizing what's important to the actual firm itself, because that's really the key differentiation, right? Is like, what are people actually optimizing for? How do they evaluate what's in front of them, and what are they looking for as a firm? So totally agree with you that that context is, impossible to ignore. In fact, it's just critical to kind of this decision making process. So um I know we're running up against time here. I appreciate you kind of chatting with me. I guess just to leave us with one last question, you've articulated throughout this interview kind of the amazing progress that AI has made, and kind of the iterative speed that it's kind of growing at. I'm curious, what are you excited about next? What are you excited to build? What are you excited both personally and professionally? And what kind of gets you, I don't know, pumped about
Yeah.
the next 6 to 12 months?
Let's see. So number one is like, I think this is also a benefit of like post kind of role evolution reflection, which is that, oh my God, like things are moving so fast. Like my mandate now is just to stay on top of it, right? In order to pick the best components to build in the context of how do we, you know, AI-fi or change venture with NextView. And even in me, like through spending all my bandwidth on it, I still feel like I cannot keep up. Like I mean, just picking it back to Claude Code and Anthropic, like picking on them, they're shipping every other week. I mean, every other day. Like I'm barely keeping up with all the releases and what we can do. So that I think that the most interesting moments in professional lives are like when you're learning a ton. Like, you know, my prior lives, I was at Blue Apron. That was the most interesting personal journey in my kind of first half of professional career because I was learning so much because I was first time product person. Company was scaling dramatically. I was, you know, learning how to build a team, build one team, two teams, three teams. So I was never bored. And I think this is a similar version of it, but different, right? Because you're learning the technology is like unfolding in front of your eyes in terms of where things can go. Like OpenClaw is not even 3 months. I mean, barely 3 months old. Like this thing came out like late November. It's crazy. And Claude Code just hit 1 year. So I think that's one. And two, in terms of like tactically speaking, what I think is interesting is that, you know, related to actually a new blog post this morning, is like, you know, we've been talking about agents, I think, since 24, and people actually didn't know what that meant. And coding agents actually became the first fully capable type of agent, and that's Claude Code and Codex. And then we have the next evolution of which is OpenClaw, which is kind of like almost like a user experience innovation in a strange way, because on one hand is like you can talk to it in Telegram, on the other hand is actually very user unfriendly for a normie to like try to figure out how to install and config. It took me like 4 hours on Friday night. And my point is that I think we're getting into the theoretical promised land of like multi-agent orchestration architecture. Now, there's significant hurdle on how to make that happen. The context issue we talked about, memory system for agent, like it's fundamentally stateless. So like, how do you do that? There's a lot of security and context gate issue around multi-agent relays and just make it all useful. But I think that's probably like one of the most interesting near-term promises. I think the other one, zooming out on like our particular narrow band of like, you know, venture and like how like I'm thinking about building internally, I think is probably the related to my last post, which is like how does the value capture happen? You know, AI is making you productive. Like, what does that mean at an individual level, at an organization level, at a society level? And I think that there are a couple different ways to skin a cat. Do you capture it internally through like a roll-up strategy? Do you masquerade as a service firm and then offer service that's done mostly by AI, but then with 90% margin? Is that going to be deflationary? Everybody does that. Are you just like, I'm just a co-pilot or human in the loop product, right? And then it all comes down to like, and then while all at the same time, the models are progressing so that what it can do in terms of consensus work continues to change. And there might be localized advantages when it comes to if you have more data that you as a company can then push the consensus frontier, because that is a verifiable task, because now you have more data to train that other people don't. So all this to say is that like I think just the speed of change at the macro and micro level is extremely high. And I think that's a lot of fun.
That's awesome. Yeah, totally agree. I think you put enough nuggets in there for, honestly, we could go on and on for a second conversation at this rate. But Melody, this was an awesome conversation. Really appreciate you coming on. I think what I keep coming back to is, you know, one, how quickly these things are shifting and how quickly it becomes real once you actually just start building. You know, it's not just using AI to get better. It's how you think about problems, systems, and even changing entire organizations. And I think your story really captures it. So, you know, a lot of people are still on the sidelines, but like you said, the fastest way is to just get started. So really appreciate you being on, and thanks again for joining us.
Thanks for having me. This was fun.